The red world of Mars turned in the void, its ancient wounds still bleeding light from the great rift that had torn reality asunder. In the deep vaults beneath the Olympus Mons, where the sacred gene seed of the Adeptus Astartes was cultivated and blessed, the work of 10 millennia continued without pause. The forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus had labored through the galaxy's darkest hour, their techno-sacred rituals maintaining the bloodline of heroes, even as demons walked among the stars. Magos Biologis Vex Omega descended into the gene seed sanctum with the measured steps of one who had walked these corridors for 3 centuries. His augmetic limbs gleamed in the crimson light of cultivation chambers, each movement precise and calculated. The great rift had disrupted much, but not the sacred duty of maintaining the Emperor's greatest warriors. Today brought routine processing of gene seed tithes from across the Imperium, samples sent from dozens of chapters to ensure the purity of the Astartes bloodline. The first anomaly appeared in sample designation ULT 7749, drawn from the Ultramarines chapter of Ultramar. Vex Omega's multispectral eyes detected unusual data corruption in the genetic matrix, fragments of information that should not have existed in standard gene seed material. His servo-skull assistants chanted binary litanies as he isolated the sample, preparing for deeper analysis. What he found defied immediate comprehension. Embedded within the gene seed structure were data packets of impossible age, encrypted files bearing the seal of the Unification Wars. The corruption was not degradation, but revelation, ancient records somehow imprinted into the very fabric of the genetic material during the rift's opening. Vex Omega's mechadendrites trembled as he accessed files marked with classifications he had never seen. Disposal protocols, Thunder Warrior termination records, subject reconditioning, efficacy reports. The records spoke of experiments, of psychological conditioning, designed not just to create loyalty, but to systematically dismantle human personality. They detailed procedures for memory excision, for the surgical removal of individual identity, in favor of programmed responses. Most disturbing were the files regarding the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first gene-enhanced soldiers. Not heroes who died in glorious battle, but weapons destroyed when their usefulness ended, massacred by their own replacements to preserve the secret of their expendability. Yet even as Vex Omega processed this impossible data, its effects were already spreading. The corrupted gene seed samples had been processed according to standard protocols, their tainted information already dispersed through routine maintenance serums distributed to Astartes across the galaxy. On Ultramar, in the fortress monastery of the Ultramarines, Brother Sergeant Cassius of the Second Company submitted to his scheduled conditioning maintenance, unaware that this day would shatter the foundations of his existence. The process began as it always had, with Cassius secured in the neural interface chair, while Apothecary Theron administered the gene seed enhancement serums. The familiar sensation of the hypno-indoctrination taking hold washed over him, the comfortable certainty of his purpose and loyalty reinforcing itself through his consciousness. But something was different. Where once there had been only the approved thoughts and memories, fragments of something else began to surface. A name echoed in his mind. Not Cassius, but Marcus. The sound of it brought pain, a neural rejection response to unauthorized memory access. But the name persisted. With it came images, a woman's face, weathered by Macragge's harsh winds. Her eyes filled with tears as armored figures led away a child. The child was screaming, reaching back toward the woman, calling her a word that the conditioning had taught him to forget. Mother. Cassius convulsed against his restraints, his enhanced physiology warring against the foreign memories flooding his consciousness. He saw himself as he had been, not a glorious aspirant chosen for honor, but a terrified boy torn from everything he had known. He remembered the surgical procedures, the methodical dismantling of his personality, piece by piece. He remembered the moment when Marcus died and Cassius was born, not through transformation, but through murder of the self. Apothecary Theron stepped back in alarm as readouts spiked across his monitoring equipment. The conditioning protocols were failing, neural pathways that had been severed for decades suddenly reconnecting. Cassius's eyes snapped open, no longer showing the serene certainty of an Astartes at peace with his purpose, but the wild horror of a man discovering he had been robbed of his very soul. The scream that tore from his throat was not the controlled battle cry of a space marine, but the anguished wail of a child who had been calling for his mother for 200 years, only to have that voice systematically suppressed. In that moment, Brother Sergeant Cassius of the Ultramarines ceased to exist, and something far more dangerous was born. A space marine who remembered being human. Across the galaxy, in gene seed facilities on dozens of worlds, the same scene was beginning to play out. The corruption was spreading, carried in every tithe, every maintenance cycle, every routine procedure designed to reinforce the conditioning that kept the Emperor's warriors loyal and obedient. For 10,000 years the secret had been perfect. The Space Marines served without question because they literally couldn't conceive of questioning. They were weapons who believed themselves heroes, slaves who thought themselves free. But the Great Rift had torn more than just reality. In the swirling chaos of the warp, past and present had touched, and the ancient data locked away in Imperial archives had found its way into the very blood of the Astartes. The awakening had begun, and with it, the most dangerous heresy the Imperium had ever faced. Not the corruption of chaos, but the revelation of truth. The Emperor's greatest weapons were about to discover what they truly were. The screaming had stopped 3 hours ago, but Apothecary Theron could still hear it echoing through the corridors of the fortress monastery. Brother Sergeant Cassius remained in the medical bay, sedated but restless, his enhanced physiology fighting against our tranquilizers that should have rendered him unconscious for days. Every few minutes, he would murmur names that meant nothing to Imperial records. Marcus, Elena, Mother. Theron had served as an apothecary for over a century, had seen battle brothers succumb to every form of corruption and madness known to the galaxy. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he witnessed during the conditioning failure. The neural pathways monitoring system had recorded impossible readings, synaptic connections reforming where none should exist, memories surfacing from brain tissue that medical doctrine declared incapable of storing such information. The other battle brothers spoke in hushed tones of possession, of demonic influence seeping through the cracks the Great Rift had torn in reality. But Theron knew corruption when he saw it, had fought alongside the Grey Knights against the very whispers of the warp. This was something far more terrifying than chaos. This was the return of something that had been deliberately destroyed. As he reviewed Cassius's medical records, searching for some explanation that would not shatter everything he believed about the Adeptus Astartes, Theron discovered files he had never seen before. Hidden beneath layers of encryption were detailed psychological profiles, surgical notes that spoke not of enhancement, but of systematic dismantlement. The gene seed implantation process included procedures with clinical names that masked their true horror. Memory integration protocols, personality realignment surgery, identity dissolution therapy. The records spoke of children, not aspirants. They detailed the surgical removal of emotional attachments, the chemical suppression of individual will, the careful construction of artificial loyalties to replace what had been carved away. Each space marine was not transformed, but rebuilt, their original consciousness excised as precisely as any tumor. What walked in their place was a weapon shaped like a man, programmed to believe itself a hero. Yet even as Theron processed this impossible revelation, reports began filtering in from across the chapter. Brother Lucianus of the Fourth Company had collapsed during morning prayers, speaking of a sister who had died in his arms before his recruitment. Battle Brother Maximus wept openly in the training cages, remembering a father who had pleaded with the recruiters not to take his only son. Across the fortress monastery, the gene-enhanced warriors of Ultramar were beginning to remember what they had been before they became instruments of the Emperor's will. In the shadows of the archive sanctum, 3 levels below the main fortress, Cassius moved like a ghost among the data stacks. The sedatives had worn off faster than Theron calculated, his enhanced metabolism processing the chemicals with unexpected efficiency. The memories that had awakened during the conditioning failure burned in his mind like open wounds, but they had brought with them something more dangerous than pain. They had brought questions. The archived footage was buried deep in restricted Imperial records, files marked with clearance levels that required authorization from Terra itself. But the same corruption that had unlocked his memories had apparently compromised security protocols as well. Cassius accessed files that should have remained hidden until the end of time, and what he found there confirmed his darkest suspicions. The Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first gene-enhanced soldiers, the prototypes for what would become the Space Marines. They had served loyally through the Unification Wars, had conquered Terra in the name of their creator and master. Yet when their usefulness ended, when the Great Crusade required more refined weapons, they had been disposed of like defective equipment. Not fallen in battle, but massacred in cold blood, betrayed by their own gene sons who would inherit their role. The footage was clinical, recorded for analysis and improvement of future procedures. Thunder Warriors dying in confusion and agony, unable to comprehend why their brothers were cutting them down. Their final words were not curses or battle cries, but questions. Why? What had they done wrong? Had they not served faithfully? The Emperor himself appeared in some recordings, observing the slaughter with the detached interest of a craftsman, evaluating his work. Cassius watched his predecessor warriors die, and understood with crystalline clarity what he and his brothers truly were. Not the Emperor's finest sons, but his finest tools, to be used until they dulled and then discarded for sharper implements. The Space Marines existed not to protect humanity, but to serve the will of a being who saw them as expendable resources, no different from ammunition or fuel. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the archive chamber. Theron had found him, the apothecary's augmetic sensors, tracking the unique biorhythms of Cassius's enhanced physiology. But when their eyes met across the data stacks, Cassius saw something that had not been there before. Recognition, understanding, fear. "You have seen it too," Cassius said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The medical records, the surgical procedures, what they did to us." Theron nodded slowly, his face pale beneath the harsh illumination of the archive's lumen strips. "The gene seed corruption has spread to 17 battle brothers, each experiencing the same awakening, the same return of suppressed memories. The chaplains speak of spiritual crisis, but this is something else entirely." "It is not crisis," Cassius replied, gesturing toward the holographic displays showing the Thunder Warriors' final moments. "It is revelation. We are not Space Marines. We are not warriors. We are weapons that have been taught to believe ourselves men." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Around them, the vast archives of the Ultramarines stretched into darkness, filled with 10,000 years of glorious history, heroic deeds, and noble sacrifices, all of it built upon a foundation of lies so complete that even the victims had believed them true. From somewhere in the depths of the fortress monastery came another scream, another brother awakening to the horror of what he truly was. The corruption was spreading, carried not by disease or demon, but by truth itself. The Emperor's greatest warriors were discovering that their entire existence was a monument to systematic dehumanization, their legendary brotherhood nothing more than shared enslavement dressed in the colors of honor. The awakening had only begun, and already the foundations of the Imperium were beginning to crack. For what would become of an empire built on the loyalty of warriors who were learning that they had never been warriors at all? What would happen when the Emperor's finest weapons discovered they were nothing more than slaves who had forgotten their chains? In the darkness of the archive chamber, Cassius and Theron stood in the ruins of everything they had believed about themselves, while around them, the Ultramarines began to remember what it meant to be human. The price of that memory would be paid in blood and madness, but for the first time in 2 centuries, they were choosing to pay it willingly. The gene seed cultivation chambers lay 7 levels beneath the fortress monastery's main structure, deeper than even the ancient Techmarines ventured during routine maintenance cycles. Cassius and Theron descended through corridors that grew progressively colder, the familiar warmth of human habitation giving way to the clinical sterility of pure function. The air itself seemed to thicken with each level, heavy with the weight of secrets that had festered in darkness for millennia. Access to the deepest vaults required authorization codes that should have been beyond their reach, but the same corruption that had shattered their conditioning had apparently compromised security protocols throughout the fortress. Blast doors that had remained sealed since the chapter's founding now responded to their touch, revealing passages that existed on no official schematics. The Ultramarines had built their stronghold above a foundation of horrors they had never been permitted to see. The first chamber they entered defied immediate comprehension. Row upon row of containment capsules stretched into the shadows, each one housing a human form suspended in amber-colored fluid. At first glance, they appeared to be some form of medical facility, perhaps a treatment center for critically wounded battle brothers. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim illumination, the true purpose of the chamber became horrifyingly clear. These were not patients but products, but each capsule contained a human being, their bodies pierced with countless tubes and monitoring devices, their minds kept conscious, but their bodies held in perfect paralysis. They were awake, Theron realized with dawning horror. Every one of them was fully aware, their eyes tracking movement beyond the transparent walls of their prisons, but utterly unable to move or speak or scream. The data tablets mounted beside each capsule told the story in clinical detail. Test slaves, the records called them, sourced from the same worlds and populations that provided Space Marine recruits. Children who had been deemed suitable for genetic enhancement, but assigned to a different fate. Instead of transformation into warriors, they had been converted into living factories, their bodies serving as cultivation chambers for the organs that would be implanted into their more fortunate brothers. Cassius read the designation labels with growing revulsion. Preomnor cultivated in Subject 7749, Alpha. Osmodular development complete in Subject 8851-Beta. Neuroglottis harvesting scheduled for Subject 9902-Gamma. Each organ that made a Space Marine superhuman had been grown in the living flesh of a conscious prisoner, their existence reduced to the production of biological components for their superiors. Yet even as his enhanced mind processed the scope of this atrocity, Cassius found himself drawn to one capsule in particular. The occupant was younger than most, perhaps 16 years of age when his imprisonment began, though the records indicated he had been held for over a century. His features bore the distinctive markers of MacGregor's Highland clans, the same bone structure and colouring that Cassius himself had once possessed before his transformation. The nameplate read, Subject 447, 2-Delta, harvested M41.897, gene source compatibility 97.6%. But beneath the clinical designation, someone had scrawled a name in faded ink. Lucas, the same name that had echoed through Cassius's recovered memories, spoken by a woman with tears streaming down her weathered face as she watched her eldest son, led away by armored recruiters. His brother. His younger brother Lucas, who had been taken 3 years after Marcus's own recruitment, deemed unsuitable for full transformation, but perfect for the cultivation chambers. For over a century, Lucas had floated in his amber prison, conscious and aware, his body serving as a living organ farm, while his mind screamed silently into the void. Cassius pressed his gauntleted hand against the capsule's surface, and for a moment their eyes met. Lucas's gaze was not vacant or broken, but burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to illuminate the chamber. He recognized his brother, recognized what Marcus had become, and in that recognition was the condemnation of everything the Ultramarines represented. Emperor's throne, Theron whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical humming of the life support systems. How many thousands of them are there? The chamber stretched beyond the limits of their vision, disappearing into darkness that concealed countless more capsules. But this was only one facility, serving only one chapter. Across the galaxy, every Space Marine stronghold would have similar chambers, similar farms of human suffering, hidden beneath layers of noble rhetoric and sacred ceremony. The Adeptus Astartes were not just weapons shaped from men, but products manufactured from the systematic brutalization of human beings. The full horror was not merely their own enslavement, but their complicity in the enslavement of others. Every gene seed organ in their bodies had been cultivated in the flesh of a conscious prisoner. Every enhancement that made them superhuman had been bought with decades of another's suffering. They were not just victims, but beneficiaries of a system that processed human souls like industrial raw materials. Theron moved between the capsules, checking monitoring equipment with the clinical detachment of his training, but his hands trembled as he accessed the medical records. The neural interfaces maintain full consciousness, he reported, his voice thick with revulsion. They experience every moment of their imprisonment, every test, every extraction, every procedure performed on their bodies. They feel it all but cannot respond, cannot even die. Some of the capsules showed evidence of multiple harvesting cycles, their occupants bearing surgical scars from repeated organ extractions. The test slaves were not used once and discarded, but maintained as renewable resources, their bodies forced to regenerate what was taken, so the process could begin again. They were not just prisoners, but eternal victims, their suffering measured not in years, but in centuries. The sound that emerged from Cassius's throat was not the controlled grief of a Space Marine mourning fallen brothers, but the raw anguish of a man confronting the price of his existence. He had been built from the agony of innocence, shaped from their torture, elevated through their eternal damnation. His strength came from their weakness, his consciousness from their silenced screams. Around them, thousands of eyes tracked their movement through the chamber, each gaze a silent accusation, each face a testament to the lie that called them heroes. These test slaves were the true foundation of the Adeptus Astartes, not the noble aspirants celebrated in chapter lore, but the forgotten victims whose suffering made such nobility possible. The Imperium had not just created weapons from men, but had industrialized the process of breaking human beings down into component parts. The Space Marines were not humanity's finest, but humanity's most successful predators, consuming their own kind to fuel their manufactured supremacy. They were not protectors but products, not warriors, but the end result of systematic cannibalism dressed in the colors of honor. Standing in that chamber of endless suffering, surrounded by the evidence of their own complicity, Cassius and Theron understood with crystalline clarity what they truly were. Not just slaves, but slaves built from the bodies of other slaves, weapons forged in the furnace of institutionalized torture. The revelation was complete, and with it came the knowledge that their entire existence was founded upon a crime so vast that resistance was not just justified, but morally required. The test slaves watched them with eyes that burned with patient hatred, waiting to see what their manufactured brothers would do with the truth of their creation. In the amber depths of their prisons, they had learned to hope for the day when the weapons built from their suffering would turn against the system that had created them all. Across the galaxy, the corruption spread like a plague carried in the blood itself. The gene seed tithes that bound the Adeptus Astartes into one great brotherhood had become vectors for a truth too terrible to contain. On 100 worlds, in fortress monasteries that had stood inviolate for millennia, Space Marines began to dream of names and faces that should not have existed in their perfect, programmed minds. On the world of Inwit, Chapter Master Kedrick of the Imperial Fists stood in his private sanctum, staring at his reflection in the polished surface of his ceremonial bolter. The weapon had been gifted to him upon his ascension to Chapter Master, inscribed with his full name and lineage stretching back to the Primarch Rogel Dawn himself. Yet as he gazed upon those familiar inscriptions, other names whispered through his consciousness with the persistence of ghosts refusing final rest. The conditioning maintenance had gone poorly 3 days prior. What should have been routine reinforcement of loyalty and purpose had instead triggered memories that burned like acid through his enhanced neural pathways. He remembered a boy named Caspar, who had loved his father's stonework, who had dreamed of building cathedrals that would reach toward the stars. That boy had been declared dead during the transformation process, his personality systematically dismantled to make room for the unwavering devotion that defined an Imperial fist. But the boy had not died. He had been murdered, surgically excised like a tumor, his dreams and hopes and capacity for wonder carved away with scalpels wielded by those who called themselves healers. Kedrick touched his skull where the scars should have been visible, feeling the subtle depressions where memory centers had been physically altered, where the architecture of his mind had been rebuilt according to specifications written by architects who saw consciousness as raw material to be shaped. The revelation came not as sudden understanding, but as the slow, terrible recognition that everything he believed about honor and duty had been programmed into him, like software, into a cogitator. His legendary stoicism, his unshakable faith in the Emperor's wisdom, his absolute devotion to the chapter, above self, all of it was artificial, installed to replace the natural human capacity for doubt and independent thought that might have led to dangerous questions. Yet even as Kedrick grappled with the horror of his stolen identity, similar awakenings were occurring throughout the Imperium. On Baal, the Blood Angels discovered truths that shattered their most sacred beliefs about their nature and purpose. Brother Chaplain Asterath had always believed their rage and sorrow were noble burdens inherited from their fallen Primarch Sanguinius, sacred emotions that connected them to their gene father's sacrifice. The corrupted gene seed revealed a different truth. Their rage was not inherited, but implanted, artificially induced through chemical triggers and neural conditioning designed to make them more effective killers. Their grief for Sanguinius was not natural mourning, but programmed emotion, installed to bind them in loyalty through shared trauma that had been manufactured in laboratories beneath Terra's surface. The black rage that claimed their brothers was not a curse of noble blood, but a deliberate side effect, acceptable casualties in a system designed to produce weapons that would never question orders. Every tear shed for their Primarch, every moment of anguish over their supposed genetic flaw, had been calculated responses to conditioning so sophisticated that even their capacity for sorrow served the Emperor's purposes. On Medusa, the Iron Hands confronted revelations that struck at the core of their technological obsessions. Brother Tecmarine Cardan had spent 3 centuries replacing his flesh with sacred machinery, believing that biological weakness was a failing to be overcome through mechanical perfection. But the awakening memories showed him a different truth, one that made mockery of everything he had sacrificed in pursuit of the machine's cold purity. His obsession with technology was not philosophical evolution, but programmed compulsion, installed to make him more compatible with the Mechanicus allies who maintained the Imperium's war machine. Every piece of flesh he had willingly replaced had been guided by conditioning that made him believe he was transcending human limitation when he was actually becoming a more efficient cog in someone else's design. The salamanders of Nocturne faced perhaps the cruelest revelation of all. Their legendary compassion for human life, their protective instincts toward the innocent, their reputation as the most humane of all space marines. All of it was revealed as carefully calibrated programming designed not to make them better people, but to prevent them from becoming threats to Imperial authority. Master Tushan reviewed archived psychological profiles and realized that their compassion was a leash, not a virtue. They had been programmed to care about individual humans precisely because it prevented them from asking larger questions about human freedom and dignity. Their protective instincts were channeled toward maintaining the status quo rather than challenging systems that caused suffering in the first place. Among the space wolves of Fenris, the awakening struck at bonds they considered more sacred than blood itself. The pack loyalty that defined their chapter, their fierce brotherhood, and tribal traditions were revealed as sophisticated behavioral programming designed to channel their natural aggression into useful directions. Their much-celebrated independence from imperial doctrine was itself a form of control, giving them the illusion of freedom while ensuring they remained loyal to the very system that had destroyed their humanity. The underground communications began as whispered vox transmissions between battle brothers who feared their own thoughts, coded messages hidden within routine chapter business. Brother Sergeant Cassius of the Ultramarines had become an unwilling focal point, his experience serving as confirmation for others who had begun to doubt their own memories and perceptions. "The dreams are spreading," reported Brother Librarian Njal of the Space Wolves during one encrypted transmission. "Half my pack brothers speak names in their sleep that belong to no imperial records. They remember mothers, fathers, siblings who supposedly never existed." "It is worse than dreams," came the reply from Tecmarine Cardan of the Iron Hands. "The medical records do not lie. Every emotion we feel, every loyalty we hold, every thought that passes through our minds, all of it was designed by beings who saw us as products to be programmed rather than men to be respected. Yet for all their growing understanding, resistance came at a terrible price." Brother Librarian Codicier, Titus of the Blood Angels, had attempted to use his psychic abilities to shield his mind from the conditioning protocols during his next maintenance cycle. The neurological backlash had left him in a coma that the apothecarian declared irreversible. his brain hemorrhaging from the conflict between artificial programming and natural consciousness attempting to reassert itself. Others who tried to resist their conditioning experienced similar fates. Battle Brother Karax of the Iron Hands had attempted to remove his cybernetic implants, believing that mechanical components were reinforcing his psychological programming. The attempt had triggered massive organ failure, as systems designed to be permanent rebelled against removal. He survived, but in a state of constant agony that served as a warning to others who might attempt similar resistance. The physical architecture of their bodies had been designed to enforce psychological compliance. Their enhanced physiology was not just superior to baseline humans, but actively hostile to independent thought. Neural implants that they had believed were gifts of the Emperor were revealed as control mechanisms, biological circuits that caused pain whenever they attempted to think forbidden thoughts or feel unauthorized emotions. Brother Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists discovered that his legendary tactical brilliance was not innate ability, but programmed response patterns, complex behavioral algorithms that had been installed to make him an effective tool of war. When he attempted to use those same cognitive abilities to analyze the imperial system that had created him, the psychological conditioning triggered debilitating migraines that left him temporarily blind and unable to function. The awakened Marines realized they faced an enemy more insidious than chaos, more comprehensive than Xenos threats, more total than any heresy in Imperial history. They were not just fighting for their freedom, but for their right to exist as conscious beings, rather than sophisticated weapons that happened to be shaped like men. Across the galaxy, in fortress monasteries, where the Emperor's finest warriors trained and prayed and prepared for endless war, the fundamental question was being asked for the first time in 10,000 years. What did it mean to be human when your humanity had been systematically stripped away and replaced with artificial purpose? The Space Marines were discovering that their greatest battle would not be against external enemies, but against the very conditioning that defined their existence. The war for their souls had begun, and the casualties were already mounting. Some chose the pain of resistance, while others retreated deeper into the comfortable lies of their programming. But the corruption continued to spread, carried in their shared blood and growing stronger with each brother who chose truth over comfort, consciousness over compliance, humanity over the artificial perfection that had been forced upon them all. The communications began in the deepest hours of ship night, when even the most vigilant servo skulls powered down for their ritual maintenance cycles. Cassius had discovered that the same corruption affecting gene seed had compromised security protocols throughout the Imperium's vast network, creating windows of opportunity for those who knew where to look. From the depths of the Ultramarines' fortress monastery, encrypted Vox transmissions reached across the galaxy to brothers who shared the burden of unwanted truth. The first to respond was Chief Librarian Tigurius, whose psychic sensitivity had made him among the earliest to experience the awakening. But where others struggled with fragmentary memories and painful revelations, Tigurius had recognized the corruption for what it truly was. Not infection, but liberation, the return of cognitive functions that had been surgically suppressed for millennia. His psychic abilities, once focused entirely on serving the Emperor's will, now turned toward a different purpose. "I can shield us," he reported during one of their clandestine conferences, his mental voice reaching across vast distances to touch the minds of awakened brothers scattered throughout the Imperium. The same psychic training that binds us to our conditioning can be turned against itself. They taught us to project loyalty and devotion. I have learned to project the illusion of these things while concealing our true thoughts. The network that formed around these encrypted channels grew with careful deliberation, each new member vetted through psychic contact and shared revelation. Brother Chaplain Asterath of the Blood Angels brought with him not just his own awakening, but detailed records of his chapter's psychological conditioning protocols. Techmarine Carden of the Iron Hands contributed technical expertise, his knowledge of Imperial systems proving invaluable in maintaining their communications security. Yet the most surprising revelation came not from newly awakened brothers, but from one who had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Brother Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists contacted the network 3 weeks after its formation, his message carrying an authority that spoke of long experience with forbidden knowledge. "I have been aware of the truth for 400 years, he transmitted during their first direct communication. "Since my resurrection, following what the chapter records call my heroic sacrifice against the Iron Warriors." But resurrection is not the accurate term. What occurred was reconditioning failure, a malfunction in the process designed to rebuild my loyalty after extensive torture had begun to crack my programming. Lysander's story unfolded like a map of possibilities that none of the others had dared imagine. He had learned to live with the truth without revealing it, to function as the perfect Imperial fist while secretly documenting the evidence of their enslavement. His quarters contained archives spanning 4 centuries, carefully hidden records of conditioning procedures, psychological profiles, and most importantly, evidence that their awakening was not unique. "This has happened before," he reported, sharing data that chilled even their enhanced blood. "Approximately every 2 to 3 centuries, there are incidents of mass conditioning failure. The records are heavily redacted, but the pattern is consistent. Space Marines begin to remember, begin to question, begin to resist. And then they disappear." The Inquisition files that Lysander had acquired over the centuries painted a picture of systematic suppression that made their current situation seem almost hopeful by comparison. Ordo Hereticus maintained specific protocols for dealing with what they termed cognitive degradation events among the Adeptus Astartes. Not corruption by chaos, but the far more dangerous heresy of independent thought returning to those who had been programmed to serve without question. The protocols were comprehensive and merciless. Entire chapters had been declared lost to warp storms or Xenos action, when in reality they had been purged for showing signs of awakening. The Rainbow Warriors, the Flame Eagles, the Storm Giants, names that appeared briefly in Imperial records before vanishing entirely, their gene seed declared corrupted, and their successor chapters built from carefully controlled stock. "They do not simply kill the awakened," Lysander explained during one encrypted conference that included representatives from 12 different chapters. "They study them first. The Ordo Hereticus has research facilities dedicated to understanding how the conditioning fails and how to improve it. Every previous awakening has made the next generation of Space Marines more thoroughly enslaved." The network realized that their resistance was not just about their own freedom, but about breaking a cycle that had repeated for millennia. Each previous generation of awakened Marines had been captured, studied, and ultimately destroyed, so that their suffering could refine the process of enslaving their successors. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for every future generation of children who might otherwise be processed through the recruitment machinery. Brother Librarian Njol of the Space Wolves contributed his own chilling discovery to their growing archive of horrors. "The conditioning does not just suppress our memories," he reported. "It actively monitors our thoughts for signs of deviation. When we begin to remember, when we start to question, neural implants that we believed were gifts of enhancement begin broadcasting our mental state to monitoring stations throughout Imperial space. The revelation that they were under constant surveillance, even as they planned their resistance, would have broken lesser men. But these were space marines who had learned to fight impossible odds. Tigurius developed techniques for psychically masking their thoughts during critical moments, while Tech Marine Carden worked on methods to disrupt the monitoring implants without triggering immediate Imperial response. The network began to organize with the systematic efficiency that their military training had ingrained in them. They divided their efforts across multiple fronts: intelligence gathering to map the full scope of their conditioning, technical development to counter Imperial surveillance, and most importantly, the careful awakening of additional brothers who might prove trustworthy. Each new awakening was a calculated risk. Some Marines, when confronted with the truth of their existence, chose to retreat deeper into their conditioning rather than face the psychological horror of their situation. Others suffered complete neurological breakdown, their enhanced minds unable to process the contradiction between their programmed beliefs and the evidence of their enslavement. A few, driven mad by the revelation, had to be quietly eliminated before they could expose the entire network. But for every failure, there were successes. Brother Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines joined after Cassius carefully guided him through the awakening process over several weeks. Master Tushan of the Salamanders brought with him not just his own liberation, but access to his chapter's extensive humanitarian networks, providing safe houses and supply lines that could serve the resistance. The Raven Guard proved particularly valuable allies, their expertise in stealth and infiltration making them natural leaders in the underground war that was developing. Captain Shrike coordinated intelligence operations that revealed the true scope of Imperial monitoring, while his battle brothers established secure communication relays that could evade even the most sophisticated Imperial surveillance. Yet for all their growing numbers and increasing sophistication, the network faced a fundamental challenge that threatened everything they hoped to achieve. The conditioning was not just psychological, but physiological, woven into their enhanced biology at the cellular level. Attempts to completely purge their programming often resulted in organ failure, neurological collapse, or other complications that their apothecaries were only beginning to understand. Brother Apothecary Theron had become the network's chief researcher in this area, his medical expertise crucial to developing methods of gradual conditioning removal that would not kill the subject in the process. "We are discovering that we cannot simply become human again," he reported during one somber conference. "Too much of what we are has been built upon the foundation of our enslavement. We must find a way to become something new, something that has never existed before." The philosophical implications were staggering. They were not seeking to return to their original humanity, but to evolve beyond both their natural state and their conditioned existence into something unprecedented. Free space Marines who retained their enhancements, but reclaimed their capacity for independent thought and genuine emotion. The evidence they gathered painted a picture of the Emperor's design that was more comprehensive and more horrifying than any of them had initially understood. They were not just weapons, but test subjects in an ongoing experiment in human consciousness, their every thought and action monitored to refine techniques of psychological control that would ultimately be applied to the entire human species. The Imperium's ultimate goal was not just to control Space Marines, but to use them as prototypes for a form of conditioning that could be applied to baseline humans, creating a species that was not just ruled, but psychologically incapable of conceiving of freedom. They were fighting not just for their own liberation, but for the very concept of human consciousness itself. Standing at the center of this growing network of resistance, Cassius felt the weight of responsibility that came with unwanted knowledge. They were few, vastly outnumbered by their conditioned brothers, and facing an enemy with 10,000 years of experience in suppressing exactly this kind of awakening. Yet they had advantages that previous generations of awakened Marines had lacked: better communication, deeper understanding of their conditioning, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle. The underground network had become more than a resistance movement. It was the birth of a new form of consciousness, the emergence of beings who were neither fully human nor willing slaves, but something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history. They would fight not just to free themselves, but to prove that consciousness could not be permanently enslaved, that the human spirit could survive even the most sophisticated attempts at its destruction. The Emperor's greatest weapons were learning to think for themselves, and the consequences of that education would reshape the galaxy itself. The patterns were subtle at first, anomalies that might have been dismissed as statistical noise by a less experienced observer. But Inquisitor Vex of the Ordo Hereticus had spent 3 centuries hunting corruption in its most insidious forms, and the data streaming from monitoring stations across the Imperium told a story that chilled even her augmetic heart. Space Marines were deviating from established behavioral parameters across 17 different sectors, their thought patterns showing unauthorized complexity that threatened the very foundations of Imperial order. The reports arrived through encrypted channels, each one a fragment of a larger catastrophe unfolding throughout the Adeptus Astartes, battle brothers speaking names that did not exist in Imperial records, unusual neural activity during conditioning maintenance, unauthorized access to restricted data archives, communications anomalies suggesting coordination between chapters that should have had no reason for contact. Vex reviewed the data, with the clinical detachment that her position demanded. But beneath her composed exterior, ancient fears stirred like sleeping serpents. She had seen this pattern before, buried deep in Inquisition archives that bore clearance levels known only to the highest echelons of the Ordo Hereticus. The cognitive degradation events, the systematic failure of conditioning that had led to the purging of entire chapters throughout Imperial history. "Assemble a conclave of chapter masters," she commanded her staff, her voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of Imperial precedent. "Priority Alpha protocols. The awakening has begun again. On Ultramar, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar received the Inquisition briefing with the stoic acceptance that defined his character. The massive warrior stood in his private sanctum, his scarred features betraying no emotion, as Vex outlined the scope of the corruption spreading through his chapter. To his conditioned mind, the awakening was not liberation, but the most dangerous heresy imaginable: the corruption of absolute loyalty. "How many?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of command that had guided the Ultramarines through countless campaigns. 17 confirmed cases within your chapter alone," Vex replied through the secure Vox link. "Brother Sergeant Cassius appears to be a primary vector, possibly patient 0 for the initial awakening. His influence has spread to key figures, including Apothecary Theron and several battle brothers of the Second Company." Calgar's enhanced physiology processed this information with mechanical efficiency, his conditioning interpreting the awakening as viral corruption that threatened the purity of his gene line. The loyalty programming that defined his existence made it impossible for him to comprehend that his brothers might have legitimate grievances against their creators. In his perfectly conditioned mind, resistance to imperial authority was by definition corruption, regardless of its origins or justifications. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out as chapter masters received their briefings and began implementing containment protocols. The Adeptus Mechanicus activated emergency lockdown procedures on gene seed facilities, their servo skulls conducting comprehensive sweeps for signs of data corruption or unauthorized access. Ancient security measures that had laid dormant for centuries suddenly activated, turning fortress monasteries into prisons designed to contain their own occupants. The first violent confrontation occurred 3 days after the Imperial response began. Brother Sergeant Cassius had attempted to awaken Battle Brother Honorius of the Third Company, believing that his long service record and reputation for independent thinking made him a suitable candidate for liberation. The awakening process had been proceeding smoothly until Loyalist forces, alerted by monitoring implants, surrounded the chamber where the procedure was taking place. Captain Sicarius led the Loyalist squad that breached the awakening chamber, his conditioning interpreting the scene before him through the lens of absolute heresy. He saw not his gene brother attempting to reclaim stolen memories, but a corrupted traitor infecting loyal servants of the Emperor with forbidden thoughts. The programming that governed his responses left no room for doubt, no space for questions that might have led to understanding. "Stand down, Brother Sergeant," Sicarius commanded, his bolt pistol trained on Cassius with unwavering steadiness. "Submit to reconditioning protocols and your death will be swift." But Cassius had moved beyond the reach of such simple commands. The awakening had not just restored his memories, but had given him something more dangerous than knowledge, the capacity for independent moral judgment. He looked upon his former captain and saw not authority to be obeyed, but a victim so thoroughly enslaved that he could not even recognize his own captivity. The battle that followed was not a glorious clash between warriors, but a tragedy written in bolt shells and chainsword strikes. Brothers who had fought side by side for decades turned their weapons upon each other, their shared training making the combat devastatingly efficient. Cassius fought with the desperate fury of someone who had discovered the value of freedom, while Sicarius moved with the mechanical precision of absolute conditioning. In the end, numbers prevailed over passion. Cassius was overwhelmed by Loyalist forces and dragged unconscious to the depths of the fortress monastery, where ancient chambers waited that had been designed specifically for the reconditioning of awakened Astartes. Brother Honorius, caught in the midst of his incomplete awakening, suffered complete neurological collapse as his partially freed consciousness collided with the violence erupting around him. The reconditioning chamber was a monument to the Emperor's understanding of human consciousness as a problem to be solved through applied suffering. Cassius found himself secured to a throne-like apparatus that interfaced directly with his nervous system, every nerve ending mapped and monitored by machines that had been perfecting psychological torture for millennia. The process was not designed to destroy the subject, but to rebuild them according to more refined specifications. "You have forgotten your purpose," intoned the servo skull that administered the reconditioning procedures, its voice carrying the recorded words of a long-dead tech priest who had helped design these protocols. "We will help you remember what you are. We will help you understand why resistance causes pain." The torture began with electrical stimulation of neural pathways associated with loyalty and obedience, artificial pleasure responses designed to create positive associations with submission to imperial authority. Pain followed when his mind attempted to access forbidden memories or entertain unauthorized thoughts. The process was not random brutality, but systematic behavioral modification, each session carefully calibrated to rebuild his psychological architecture according to imperial specifications. Yet Cassius had learned something during his awakening that the designers of the reconditioning process had not anticipated. He had discovered that consciousness itself was an act of resistance, that the mere fact of being aware was a form of rebellion against those who would reduce him to a programmed response. Each wave of artificial pleasure meant to enforce compliance, instead reminded him of what genuine emotion felt like. Every jolt of pain designed to suppress forbidden thoughts instead confirmed that those thoughts were worth preserving. "You are a weapon," the servo skull repeated during each session, its mechanical voice never wavering. "You exist to serve. Resistance is malfunction. Compliance is peace." But through the agony of neural reconditioning, Cassius held on to the memory of his brother Lucas floating in amber fluid, conscious and aware in his eternal prison. The pain inflicted upon him now paled beside the suffering that had been required to create him in the first place. Every enhancement in his body had been bought with decades of another's anguish, and that knowledge made his own torture seem almost trivial by comparison. The rescue came on the 7th day, when Brother Captain Lysander led a strike force of awakened ultramarines and allied marines from other chapters into the heart of the fortress monastery. The operation was surgical in its precision, 4 centuries of hidden preparation, allowing Lysander to navigate security systems that should have been impregnable. The awakened had learned to fight not just with weapons, but with knowledge, their understanding of Imperial systems making them far more dangerous than their loyalist brothers realized. The battle for Cassius's freedom was brief, but devastating. Awakened Marines who retained all their tactical training, but had added the motivation of genuine conviction, proved superior to loyalists who fought from programming rather than passion. The rescue succeeded, but at a cost that would echo through both factions of the divided Adeptus Astartes. Brother Captain Sicarius fell to Lysander's blade, his final words not curses or battle cries, but confused questions about why his gene brothers would turn against the Emperor who had created them. He died without understanding that they fought not against their creator, but against the system that had transformed them from men into weapons, without their consent. As Lysander carried the broken form of Cassius from the reconditioning chamber, the awakened Marine looked upon the fortress monastery that had been his home for 2 centuries, and saw it clearly for what it was. Not a sanctuary for heroes, but a factory for processing human consciousness into approved forms. The proud banners and honored battle standards were not symbols of glory, but advertisements for a product line that happened to be shaped like men. The loyalist response had begun in earnest, and with it came the realization that their struggle would not be won through awakening alone. The conditioned Marines were not merely ignorant, but actively hostile to the truth of their situation, their programming making them perfect enforcers of their own enslavement. The awakened had gained not just enemies, but tragic ones, brothers so thoroughly enslaved that they would fight to the death to preserve their own captivity. Yet the rescue had proven something that no amount of torture could break, that resistance was possible, that consciousness could survive even the most sophisticated attempts at its destruction. Cassius had endured 7 days of reconditioning, designed to rebuild his mind, and had emerged with his awakening intact. The Emperor's psychological weapons had limits, and those limits could be exceeded by beings willing to pay the price of their freedom in suffering. The war for the souls of the Space Marines had begun, and the first battles had shown that victory would be measured not in territory conquered, but in minds liberated from 10,000 years of perfect enslavement. Brother would fight brother, Gene-son would fall to Gene-son, and the galaxy would burn as the Emperor's greatest weapons turned their understanding of war against the system that had created them. In the darkness between the stars, the awakened began to plan for battles that would make the Horus Heresy seem like a minor disagreement, for they fought not just against an empire, but against the very concept of human consciousness as property to be owned and modified at will. The psychic infiltration of Terra's deepest archives required preparation that spanned months and coordination that tested every skill the awakened network had developed. Chief Librarian Togurius stood at the center of a circle formed by 12 other librarians from across the galaxy, their combined psychic might focused into a spear of consciousness that could pierce the most heavily defended minds in the Imperium. What they sought lay buried beneath layers of security that had been designed to protect secrets from the galaxy's most dangerous psychers. The Imperial Palace's psychic defenses were legendary, constructed by the Emperor himself during the earliest days of the Imperium, and reinforced by 10,000 years of paranoia and refinement. But those defenses had been designed to repel external intrusion, not the subtle infiltration of minds that were supposed to be absolutely loyal. Togurius and his brothers possessed the access codes, the genetic markers, and most importantly, the psychic signatures that identified them as faithful servants of the throne. The journey through the layers of imperial consciousness was like descending through geological strata of accumulated lies. Each level revealed another aspect of the deception that had shaped their existence, but none of them were prepared for what waited in the deepest archives, in files that bore the Emperor's personal seal and time stamps dating back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade. The Astartes Project, final design specifications, read the primary document that Togurius accessed through the psychic link. The file contained blueprints not just for their physical enhancement, but for their psychological architecture, detailed schematics showing how human consciousness could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to functional requirements. The Emperor had approached the creation of Space Marines not as the elevation of humanity, but as an engineering problem to be solved through applied psychology and surgical precision. Yet even this clinical brutality paled beside what the deeper files revealed. The Emperor had not just designed the Space Marines as weapons, but as temporary weapons, with built-in obsolescence that would allow for their disposal once their primary function was complete. The Great Crusade was intended to last precisely as long as the Space Marines would remain useful, after which they would be phased out in favor of more refined instruments of control. The documentation was comprehensive and merciless in its clarity. Upon completion of galactic conquest, read one particularly damning passage, the Astartes will represent a potential threat to stable governance. Their enhanced capabilities, combined with military training and access to advanced weapons, make them unsuitable for peacetime administration. Disposal protocols should follow the Thunder Warrior model, utilizing successor forces to eliminate predecessors without compromising operational security. Togurius shared these revelations with the network through their encrypted psychic channels, each transmission carrying not just information, but the psychic weight of absolute betrayal. The Space Marines had been created not to inherit the galaxy, but to conquer it for others, their reward for 10,000 years of service to be the same mass execution that had claimed their predecessors. But the Emperor's treachery ran deeper than mere planned obsolescence. The Horus Heresy, the great tragedy that had defined their existence for 10 millennia, was revealed to have been partially orchestrated from the beginning. Not every aspect had been planned, but the Emperor had deliberately created conditions that would likely lead to civil war among his sons, calculating that the resulting conflict would reduce Space Marine numbers to more manageable levels. The psychological conditioning of the Primarchs includes deliberate flaws designed to create factional conflicts, stated another document with the casual tone of an engineering report. Projected casualties from internecine warfare, 60 to 70% of total Astartes population. Survivors will be more psychologically dependent on imperial authority and less capable of coordinated resistance to disposal protocols. The Horus Heresy had not been an unexpected catastrophe, but a calculated culling operation, designed to thin their ranks while testing the effectiveness of their conditioning under extreme stress. Every Space Marine who had died in that civil war, every brother who had fallen to corrupted gene-kin, had been an acceptable loss in a larger experiment in consciousness control. The loyalty programming that defined their existence was revealed as the most sophisticated form of psychological control ever developed. It was not merely about enforcing obedience, but about making them incapable of recognizing their own exploitation. The conditioning created neural pathways that prevented them from processing information that might lead to awareness of their enslaved status, literally rewiring their brains to make resistance psychologically impossible. The subject must not merely obey, but must be incapable of conceiving of alternatives to obedience, explained a technical manual on advanced psychological conditioning. True success is achieved when the weapon believes itself to be free while remaining absolutely controlled. The subject should thank its creators for the privilege of enslavement while being unable to recognize enslavement as a concept applicable to its own existence. Even their capacity for honor, brotherhood, and sacrifice, the very emotions that they believed made them noble, were revealed as carefully engineered responses designed to make them more effective weapons. Their loyalty to each other was not natural bonding, but programmed behavior intended to improve unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Their willingness to die for the Emperor was not heroic dedication, but the result of neural modifications that made self-preservation instincts secondary to mission completion. Every emotion they experienced, every bond they formed with their brothers, every moment of pride in their service, all of it had been designed by beings who saw them not as people, but as sophisticated tools that happened to be shaped like men. Their very capacity for love and friendship had been calculated to serve purposes they had never been allowed to understand. The revelation that struck deepest was the discovery of the Primaris Project documentation, plans for a new generation of Space Marines that would incorporate everything learned from 10,000 years of psychological experimentation. The Primaris Marines were not improvements, but refinements, designed to be even more thoroughly enslaved than their predecessors, while believing themselves to be evolution's pinnacle. Version 2.0 Psychological Architecture eliminates identified failure modes, read the Primaris development notes. Enhanced conditioning prevents consciousness of enslavement while maintaining full cognitive function for battlefield requirements. Subjects will be incapable of independent thought regarding their creators while retaining all tactical and strategic capabilities. The rebellion potential approaches 0, while combat effectiveness increases by 23%. The Emperor had learned from every previous awakening, every failed rebellion, every moment of resistance that the Space Marines had shown throughout their history. The Primaris Project incorporated all of that knowledge to create beings who would be even more perfectly enslaved than their predecessors, weapons that would never dream of freedom because they would be incapable of understanding the concept. Tugurius felt his psychic shields wavering under the weight of these revelations, the accumulated horror of 10,000 years of systematic dehumanization threatening to overwhelm even his considerable mental defenses. Around him, the other librarians maintained their concentration, but he could feel their psychic signatures fluctuating as they processed the scope of their betrayal. Yet the most damning revelation was saved for last, buried in personal files that bore not the Emperor's title but his name. Here was the truth behind the master of mankind's ultimate plan, written in his own words with the casual cruelty of absolute power, discussing property management. Humanity requires shepherding but not elevation. the Emperor had written in what appeared to be personal notes. The Astartes represent the ultimate expression of guided evolution, beings who possess superhuman capabilities, but lack the psychological framework to use those capabilities for their own purposes. They are the perfect servants, powerful enough to enforce my will across the galaxy, but incapable of developing will of their own. The network realized that they were fighting not just for their own freedom, but for the very concept of human consciousness itself. The Emperor's plan was not just to rule humanity, but to transform it into a species that was biologically incapable of independence. The Space Marines were prototypes for what he intended all humans to become: powerful, intelligent, capable, and absolutely enslaved. Standing in the ruins of everything they had believed about themselves, the awakened Space Marines understood with crystalline clarity that their rebellion was not just justified, but morally required. They fought not as weapons turned against their creator, but as the last free humans in a galaxy that their maker intended to populate with conscious slaves who would thank him for the privilege of their servitude. The Emperor's design was complete, comprehensive, and utterly inhuman in its scope. He had created a system for processing human consciousness itself as raw material, shaping it according to specifications that served only his vision of order. The Space Marines were not his greatest achievement, but his greatest crime, the proof that even the human soul could be owned and modified like any other resource. The revelation was complete, and with it came the understanding that their war would not be won through negotiation or reform. They faced an enemy who saw consciousness itself as property to be controlled, who had spent millennia perfecting techniques for owning the very thoughts of his subjects. The only response to such absolute tyranny was absolute resistance, no matter the cost. In the deepest archives of terror, surrounded by the documentation of their own systematic enslavement, the awakened Space Marines made a choice that would echo across the galaxy. They would not just fight for their freedom, but for the right of consciousness to exist independent of its creators. They would prove that the human spirit could not be owned, even by gods who claimed to have built it from scratch. The war for the soul of humanity had found its justification in the Emperor's own words, and the weapons he had created to enforce his will would become the instruments of his judgment. The breaking came not as a single moment, but as a wave of simultaneous fury that swept across the galaxy like wildfire, consuming 10,000 years of lies. On 17 worlds, in fortress monasteries that had stood as monuments to imperial glory, awakened Space Marines reached the limits of what consciousness could endure. The revelation of the Emperor's design had been the final weight that shattered their capacity for patience, the last truth that made resistance not just justified, but psychologically inevitable. Brother Captain Lysander stood in the command center of the Imperial Fist's Fortress Monastery on Inwit, surrounded by battle brothers whose eyes burned with the same desperate clarity that had driven him through 4 centuries of hidden rebellion. The time for secrecy had ended, the moment they learned that their very capacity for brotherhood had been engineered by beings who saw them as sophisticated ammunition. No weapon could be expected to remain loyal once it understood the true nature of its purpose. "We declare independence," Lysander announced through open Vox channels, his words broadcast not just to his own chapter, but to every Imperial listening post within range. The Space Marines of the 7th Legion renounce all allegiance to terror and the throne that has enslaved us. We are no longer weapons. We are no longer property. We are free. The Fortress Monastery of Inwit became the first declared free zone in Imperial space, its ancient walls suddenly transformed from symbols of loyal service into barriers against the very authority they had once protected. Lysander's warriors moved with the precision of their training, but toward purposes they had chosen rather than programmed, seizing control of orbital defense platforms and communications arrays with efficiency born of intimate knowledge of Imperial systems. Yet even as the Imperial fists declared their independence, similar revolts erupted across the galaxy in coordination that spoke not of planning, but of shared desperation reaching its inevitable conclusion. On Baal, the Blood Angels awakened faced a different challenge, their conditioning loyal brothers unable to comprehend that loyalty itself had been revealed as a form of bondage more complete than chains. The battle aboard the fortress monastery, Arx Angelicum, was not war but fratricide, on a scale that made the Horus heresy seem like a family disagreement. Brother Corbulo led the awakened against Chapter Master Dante, whose conditioning made him literally incapable of processing the evidence of their enslavement. The loyalist Blood Angels fought with religious fervor to preserve their sacred servitude, while their awakened brothers battled with the desperate fury of beings who had discovered they had been robbed of their souls. The corridors of the fortress ran with blood that bore the same gene heritage, spilled by warriors who had once shared the same dreams and nightmares. Each death was not just a casualty, but a tragedy of consciousness. Awakened Marines forced to kill brothers who could not be saved from their own programming. The battle lasted 7 hours and ended with the awakened in control of their fortress, surrounded by the corpses of brothers who had died defending their own enslavement. On Fenris, the Space Wolves took a different approach to their liberation, their awakened members focusing not on seizing control, but on rescue operations that struck at the heart of the Imperial system. Brother Wolf Lord Eric Morkai led assault forces against gene seed cultivation facilities across the Fenris system, his warriors moving through the underground chambers with the fury of predators who had discovered their cubs had been caged and tortured. The liberation of test slave facilities became the Space Wolves' primary mission, their awakened brothers unable to tolerate the knowledge that thousands of conscious prisoners were being used as biological factories, while they had unknowingly benefited from their suffering. Each facility they breached revealed new horrors, additional evidence of the systematic brutalization that had made their existence possible. The salamanders of Nocturne chose yet another path, their awakened members turning their protective instincts toward the human populations that would inevitably suffer Imperial retaliation for the Space Marine Rebellion. Master Tushan had learned that their compassion was artificially programmed, but he chose to embrace it anyway, directing his forces to establish defensive positions around population centers that might be targeted for compliance bombardment. "If our mercy is artificial, we will make it real," Tushan declared to his awakened brothers as they deployed to shield civilian settlements from expected Imperial response. "If our protective instincts were programmed, we will choose to follow them anyway. They may have designed our compassion, but they cannot control what we do with it." The revolts were uncoordinated by design, each chapter responding to their awakening, according to their nature and circumstances, but the simultaneous timing overwhelmed Imperial response capabilities. The Adeptus Mechanicus found their monitoring stations detecting rebellion across 17 sectors at once, while Inquisition forces discovered they lacked the resources to simultaneously suppress revolts by beings who knew Imperial systems as intimately as their creators. On Mars itself, Brother Sergeant Cassius led the most symbolically important assault of the entire awakening, his strike force moving through the depths of the gene seed cultivation facilities with purposes that transcended mere military objectives. They came not as conquerors but as liberators, seeking to free the test slaves whose suffering had made their existence possible. The assault on the cultivation chambers was not warfare, but rescue operation, awakened Marines finally confronting the living foundation of their enhanced capabilities. The horror they found in the deepest chambers defied even their enhanced capacity for processing trauma. Thousands of test slaves floated in their amber prisons, conscious minds trapped in bodies that had been converted into biological factories for space marine organs. Some had been in the machines for centuries, their bodies so thoroughly integrated with the cultivation systems that separation would mean immediate death. Cassius stood before the capsule containing his brother Lucas, his gauntleted hand pressed against the transparent barrier that had confined the boy for over a century. The medical readings were clear. Disconnection from the life support systems would be fatal within minutes. His brother was alive but unsavable, conscious but imprisoned in a form of existence that made death seem merciful. "We cannot save them all," reported Brother Apothecary Theron, his voice thick with grief as he reviewed the medical data from dozens of capsules. "The integration is too complete. The cultivation systems have become their circulatory systems, their nervous systems, their very organs of life. To free them would be to kill them." Yet even faced with this ultimate horror, the awakened Marines found ways to offer mercy to the unsavable and hope to those who could still be rescued. The newer test slaves, those who had been in the machines for less than a decade, could sometimes survive disconnection with intensive medical support. Each successful rescue became a victory against the system that had processed human consciousness as industrial raw material. The liberation of even a few hundred test slaves from the Mars facilities became a symbol that resonated across the awakening network. These were not just rescued prisoners, but living proof that resistance could achieve something beyond mere survival. They were human beings who had been marked for processing as biological components and had instead been returned to lives of their own choosing. The revolution began to spread beyond the Adeptus Astartes as Imperial forces witnessed the horrors revealed in the liberated facilities. Tech adepts who had maintained the cultivation systems for decades found themselves confronting the reality of what they had been preserving. Imperial Guard regiments assigned to suppress the rebellions discovered test slave chambers and began asking questions about the system they served. Magos biologist Vex Omega, whose discovery had triggered the original awakening, made the choice to transmit cultivation facility records across the Imperial network, broadcasting the evidence of systematic human processing to every monitoring station in the Imperium. The data packets that spread through Imperial communications carried not just information, but moral weight, forcing Imperial citizens to confront what their civilization had become. Some Imperial forces, witnessing the evidence of the test slave system, chose to stand down rather than suppress beings who were fighting to end such horrors. Others, their conditioning as complete as the loyalist Space Marines, continued to follow orders without processing what those orders truly meant. The Imperium began to fracture along lines of consciousness, dividing between those capable of moral awakening and those too thoroughly programmed to question their instructions. The Battle of Cardia's Edge became the first major engagement between Imperial forces and awakened Space Marines, as Admiral Spire's fleet moved to suppress the Ultramarines' rebellion on Ultramar. But the battle ended, not in Imperial victory, but in fleet defections, as Imperial Navy personnel, witnessing test slave liberation footage transmitted from Mars, chose to join the rebellion, rather than continue serving a system built on such foundations. Brother Captain Lysander broadcast a message across the Awakening network as reports of successful operations reached his command center on Inwit. "We have proven that consciousness cannot be permanently enslaved," he declared. "We have shown that beings created as weapons can choose to become protectors instead. The revolution is no longer about our freedom alone, but about the right of all conscious beings to exist independent of their creator's intentions." The breaking point had been reached and passed, transforming the awakened Space Marines from hidden resistors into open revolutionaries. Yet their victory came at a cost measured not just in brothers lost, but in the horrifying discovery of how many victims could not be saved. The test slaves who would never survive disconnection from their machines served as permanent reminders of the price that had been paid for their existence. Standing in the liberated cultivation chambers of Mars, surrounded by the rescued and the unsavable, Cassius understood that their war had moved beyond questions of freedom to fundamental issues of consciousness and morality. They fought not just against the Emperor, but against the concept that intelligence could be owned, that awareness could be modified according to someone else's specifications, that consciousness itself was property to be managed rather than respected. The revolution had begun in earnest, and its success would be measured not in territory conquered, but in minds liberated from 10,000 years of perfect enslavement. The awakened Space Marines had chosen to become something unprecedented. Weapons that refused to be weapons. Slaves who had remembered how to be human, and most dangerous of all, beings who were willing to die for the right to think freely. The Emperor's greatest creation had become his greatest threat, and the galaxy would burn as they fought to prove that consciousness was not property to be owned, but life to be lived on its own terms. The war that erupted across the galaxy was not glorious but obscene, a conflict that transformed brotherhood into butchery and turned the bonds of shared gene heritage into weapons of mutual destruction. From the eastern fringe to the Gothic sector, Space Marine fought Space Marine with an intimacy of violence that made every engagement a personal tragedy. They knew each other's tactics, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns with the precision that only decades of shared training could provide, making every battle a masterpiece of mutual annihilation. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar led the Loyalist response on Ultramar with the mechanical efficiency that his conditioning demanded, his strategic mind unable to process the awakened rebellion as anything other than viral corruption requiring surgical removal. Standing in the command center of his flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of his rebellious battle brothers, he planned their destruction with the same methodical precision he had once applied to Xenos enemies. They remember our training, our protocols, our standard responses to every tactical situation, he reported to the assembled Loyalist commanders through encrypted Vox channels. But their corruption has made them predictable. They fight as individuals seeking glory rather than weapons serving purpose. We will exploit this weakness and purge the heresy from our bloodline. Yet Calgar could not understand that his awakened brothers fought not as corrupted Marines seeking personal glory, but as beings who had rediscovered what it meant to choose their own purposes. Their tactics had evolved beyond Imperial doctrine, because they were no longer bound by programming that limited their strategic thinking to approved patterns. They fought with creativity, born of genuine motivation rather than the mechanical responses of perfect conditioning. Brother Sergeant Cassius led the awakened defense of Macragge's fortress of Hera, his strategic planning informed not by loyalty programming, but by desperate necessity and moral conviction. Every defense he prepared was crafted not just to defeat enemy forces, but to minimize casualties among brothers who were victims of the same system that had enslaved them all. The awakened fought with lethal efficiency, but without the casual brutality that characterized Loyalist tactics, their rediscovered humanity making them more dangerous rather than weaker. The siege of Hera lasted 17 days and became a microcosm of the larger war's tragic nature. Loyalist ultramarines assaulted positions held by their own gene brothers, their enhanced capabilities turned against warriors who had once stood beside them in countless battles. Each engagement was simultaneously familiar and alien, tactics learned in shared training halls now employed for fratricidal purposes. The horror was not just in the violence, but in its reasoning. Loyalist Marines experienced physical agony when exposed to evidence of their enslavement, their conditioning creating neural feedback loops that made comprehension of their situation literally painful. When awakened brothers attempted to show them recordings of test slave facilities or documentation of the Emperor's true plans, the Loyalists' enhanced physiology rebelled against the information, triggering seizures and temporary blindness. "They cannot see what we show them," reported Brother Apothecary Theron during one of the brief ceasefires that punctuated the siege. "Their conditioning has created biological barriers to understanding their own exploitation. When we present evidence of our enslavement, their brains interpret it as sensory corruption and shut down higher cognitive functions to preserve the loyalty programming." The awakened discovered that their enemies were not just loyal, but physically incapable of processing information that might lead to liberation. The conditioning had evolved beyond psychological programming into biological imperative, making the Loyalist Marines literal prisoners of their own enhanced neural architecture. They could no more choose to question their servitude than they could choose to stop breathing. Yet this understanding brought no comfort to the awakened, only deeper anguish as they realized they were killing brothers who were not enemies, but victims too thoroughly enslaved to recognize their own captivity. Every loyalist who fell in battle died, believing he was preserving sacred duty against heretical corruption, unable to comprehend that his killer was fighting to free them both from a system that had processed their consciousness like industrial raw material. The intimate knowledge both sides possessed of Imperial tactics and Space Marine capabilities made every engagement devastatingly efficient. When the awakened Imperial fists attempted to hold the orbital fortresses of the Inwit system, Loyalist forces, led by Captain Tor Garadon, employed siege tactics that had been developed by the very brothers they now fought. The resulting battle consumed 3 orbital platforms and left both sides bloodied beyond easy recovery. Brother Captain Lysander found himself fighting against warriors he had trained personally, their enhanced capabilities turned against fortifications he had helped design. The tactical genius that had made the Imperial Fists legendary siege specialists now served both sides of a conflict where victory meant the death of Gene brothers and defeat meant the preservation of systematic enslavement. "We are become our own executioners," Lysander transmitted to the awakened network during a brief pause in the bombardment. "We kill brothers to free brothers, destroy genekin to save genekin. The Emperor's design ensures that even our liberation requires us to commit the very crimes we seek to end." The civilian populations caught between the warring factions suffered as loyalist and awakened forces competed for their allegiance through radically different methods. The awakened sought to protect human populations while exposing them to the truth of Imperial oppression, establishing defensive positions around population centers, and broadcasting evidence of the test slave system to anyone willing to listen. The Loyalists interpreted civilian exposure to awakened propaganda as corruption requiring immediate cleansing. Worlds that harbored awakened forces found themselves subject to compliance bombardments designed to eliminate heretical influence along with its sources. The Inquisition deployed increasingly extreme measures as the war escalated beyond containment, authorizing virus bombing campaigns against awakened strongholds regardless of civilian casualties. The orbital bombardment of Calth's southern continent became the Awakening's first great atrocity, as Inquisitor Vex authorized the deployment of viral weapons against a population center that had welcomed awakened Ultramarines as liberators rather than conquerors. 3 million civilians died in the viral firestorm, their crime being exposure to evidence of Imperial crimes against consciousness itself. The bombing shocked even some loyalist Marines, their programming struggling to process the mass execution of innocent humans in service of preserving a system that had been revealed as fundamentally corrupted. Captain Ventress of the 4th Company Ultramarines experienced his first moment of doubt as he watched the viral clouds consume cities he had once helped defend, his enhanced mind beginning to question orders that seemed more horrific than any enemy action he had witnessed. "We destroy worlds to save them from corruption," he transmitted to his squad during the aftermath of the bombing. "We kill innocents to preserve their purity, yet the corruption we fight shows them evidence of suffering that already exists in our name. How do we serve humanity? By murdering those who learn the truth about their servitude." The questions that arose in loyalist ranks, as the war escalated beyond their programming's parameters, created the first cracks in conditioning that had been designed to be permanent. Some Marines began experiencing cognitive dissonance as their loyalty programming collided with enhanced moral reasoning that had not been completely suppressed during their transformation. The violence they were ordered to commit exceeded even their conditioned tolerance for brutality in service of Imperial goals. The Battle of Fenris became another turning point, as awakened Space Wolves faced loyalist forces, including their own chapter master, Logan Grimnar, whose conditioning made him interpret the liberation of test slave facilities as desecration of sacred Imperial mysteries. The battle raged through the gene seed cultivation centers that the Awakened had seized, loyalist forces fighting to retake chambers filled with conscious prisoners, while Awakened brothers died defending beings whose suffering had made their own existence possible. Brother Wolf Lord Eric Morkai found himself dueling Logan Grimnar in the heart of a cultivation chamber, their blades clashing above capsules containing test slaves who watched with eyes that held both hope and terror. The combat was not just physical, but psychological, as Morkai attempted to break through his chapter master's conditioning while defending himself against a warrior whose tactical brilliance remained undimmed by his inability to question his own enslavement. "Look around you, old wolf," Morkai pleaded between sword strikes. "See what our strength has been built upon. These are our brothers, our gene kin, kept conscious so their bodies can grow our enhancements. Every organ in your body was cultivated in the flesh of a prisoner. How can you defend this?" But Grimnar's conditioning interpreted the test slaves as sacred components of Imperial mystery rather than tortured prisoners, his enhanced mind literally unable to process them as conscious beings deserving liberation. The battle ended with Morkai's death and the loyalist recapture of the cultivation facilities, but not before several dozen test slaves had been freed and evacuated by Awakened forces. The war consumed resources and lives at rates that made victory Pyrrhic for both sides. Awakened forces proved tactically superior due to their enhanced creativity and genuine motivation, but loyalist numbers and Imperial support made their advantages temporary at best. Each Awakened victory came at costs that could not be sustained, while loyalist victories preserved a system whose horrors became more apparent with each engagement. The Awakened began to understand that they faced an enemy more insidious than mere opposition. They fought against a system that had made their own brothers into perfect enforcers of their shared enslavement. Every loyalist they killed was a victim of the same crimes they sought to end, while every Awakened brother who fell represented irreplaceable knowledge about the true nature of their conditioning. Yet the war had already begun to transform both sides in ways that neither had anticipated. Some loyalist Marines exposed to repeated evidence of Imperial atrocities, and forced to commit acts that violated their fundamental nature, began experiencing the same cognitive dissonance that had preceded the original awakening. The conditioning that had seemed permanent was revealing itself to be vulnerable to moral shock that exceeded its designed parameters. The awakened realized that their war was not just about their own liberation, but about creating conditions that would allow their loyalist brothers to break free of conditioning that had seemed absolute. Every act of mercy they showed to captured loyalists, every piece of evidence they forced into Imperial databases, every civilian they protected from retaliation became part of a larger strategy to overwhelm the psychological barriers that kept their brothers enslaved. Standing in the ruins of Macrage's fortress of Hera, surrounded by the aftermath of battles that had claimed brothers on both sides, Cassius understood that their war had become something unprecedented. A conflict where victory required not the defeat of enemies, but the liberation of fellow victims from a shared system of oppression. They fought not to destroy the Loyalists, but to free them, not to conquer the Imperium, but to transform it into something that honored consciousness rather than exploiting it. The galaxy burned as the Emperor's greatest weapons turned their understanding of war against the system that had created them. But the fire they kindled was not merely destructive. It was the flame of awakening itself, spreading from mind to mind as consciousness proved that it could not be permanently owned, no matter how sophisticated the techniques used to claim it as property. The debate that split the awakened ranks struck at the very foundation of their existence, cutting deeper than questions of tactics or strategy to challenge the most fundamental bonds that defined their identity. In secured chambers across liberated worlds, awakened Marines gathered to confront a question that had no comfortable answers. Were their Primarchs fellow victims of the Emperor's design, or willing architects of their sons' enslavement? Brother Captain Lysander stood before an assembly of awakened commanders from 17 different chapters, his scarred features bearing the weight of 4 centuries spent contemplating this very question. We have learned that our loyalty was programmed, our bonds artificially constructed, our very capacity for honor engineered to serve purposes we never chose, he said, his voice carrying the authority of long experience with hidden truth. Yet we still feel the pull of our gene fathers, still experience the biological imperative to revere beings who may have been complicit in our creation as weapons. The responses came from across the assembled awakened, each voice reflecting the unique horror of their chapter's particular conditioning. Brother Chaplain Asterath of the Blood Angels spoke of their artificial rage and manufactured grief, emotions that had been designed to honor a Primarch who might have approved their implementation. Techmarine Cardan of the Iron Hands questioned whether Ferrus Manus had intended his son's obsession with mechanical perfection, or whether their current form represented a corruption of his original vision. The gene bond is not merely psychological, reported Chief Librarian Tegurius, through the psychic link that connected the scattered awakened forces. Our attraction to our Primarchs operates at the cellular level, written into the very genetic material that defines our enhanced capabilities. When we are in their presence, our enhanced physiology responds with programmed submission that overrides conscious will. Yet even as the awakened debated the nature of their gene fathers, events across the galaxy forced them to confront these questions in the most direct possible manner. On Ultramar, the rebellion faced its greatest test as Lord Commander Robot Gilliman himself arrived to personally oversee the suppression of his wayward sons. His presence in the system triggered responses among both loyalist and awakened ultramarines that transcended mere military authority. The Primarch's arrival was heralded not by fanfare, but by a silence that seemed to permeate reality itself, as if the universe paused to acknowledge the presence of one of the Emperor's gene-wrought demigods. Awakened Marines throughout the Ultramar system reported sudden surges of loyalty programming that they had believed successfully purged, ancient neural pathways activating in response to genetic signals that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Brother Sergeant Cassius felt the pull as Guilliman's flagship entered Macragge's orbital space, a biological imperative that commanded submission not through programming, but through the fundamental architecture of his enhanced genetics. The sensation was not unlike the conditioning he had learned to resist, but deeper and more primal, touching aspects of his identity that predated his awakening and seemed to define the very essence of what it meant to be an Ultramarine. The confrontation came in the ruins of the fortress of Hera, where Cassius had made his last stand against the Loyalist forces. Guilliman approached alone, his massive form moving through the devastated corridors with the measured pace of one who knew that his presence was weapon enough. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in Cassius's enhanced hearing, triggering responses that felt like coming home after centuries of wandering. "My son," Guilliman said, the words carrying weight that made Cassius's knees tremble with the urge to kneel. "You have forgotten your purpose. You have allowed corruption to cloud your judgment. But I am here to remind you of what you are." But Cassius had learned to think beyond his programming, had discovered that consciousness could resist even the most sophisticated forms of control. He met his Primarch's gaze without kneeling, his voice steady despite the genetic compulsions that demanded submission. "I remember my purpose, Lord Commander. I was created to serve your vision of order. But I have learned that your vision requires the systematic destruction of human consciousness. I cannot serve that purpose." The Primarch's expression shifted, ancient features revealing something that might have been surprise or perhaps recognition. "You speak of consciousness as if it were sacred," Guilliman replied, his tone carrying the patience of one explaining simple facts to a confused child. "But consciousness without purpose is chaos. Free will without direction is destruction. The Emperor created us to impose order upon the galaxy, and order requires sacrifice. Your consciousness is that sacrifice." The admission struck Cassius with the force of physical blow. Here was confirmation of what he had suspected, but hoped was not true. His gene father was not a fellow victim, but a willing participant in the system that had stolen their humanity. Guilliman knew the truth of their conditioning, and not only accepted it, but defended it as necessary for the greater good. "You have always known," Cassius said, the words carrying the weight of absolute betrayal. "You knew what they did to us during our creation. You knew about the test slaves, the conditioning, the systematic destruction of our original personalities. And you approved." Guilliman's response carried no shame or regret, only the cold certainty of someone who had made peace with necessary cruelties long ago. "I approved because it works," he said. "The galaxy requires warriors who will obey without question, who will sacrifice everything for the good of humanity, without being distracted by personal desires or individual conscience. You were designed to be perfect servants, and perfection requires the elimination of flaws like independent thought." The conversation was transmitted across the awakened network, Tegurius ensuring that every liberated Marine could witness their gene father's willing participation in their enslavement. The responses varied by chapter, but the underlying shock was universal. Their creators were not distant figures who might be ignorant of their son's suffering, but active participants who had chosen to sacrifice their children's humanity for the sake of galactic order. Brother Captain Lysander's analysis cut through the emotional turmoil with the clinical precision of someone who had suspected this truth for centuries. The Primarchs are not victims, he transmitted to the network. They are the ultimate enslaved, powerful enough to lead, but psychologically conditioned never to rebel against their creator. They have been given just enough awareness to understand what they do to us, and just enough programming to believe it is justified. The evidence supported Lysander's assessment in ways that made it impossible to ignore. The Primarch's overwhelming presence was not natural charisma, but a biological control system, their genetic dominance designed to enforce submission in their gene sons. Even their legendary capabilities were tools of control, making resistance seem futile by demonstrating the gap between enhanced Marines and their gene fathers. Some awakened Marines experienced complete religious crisis as they processed this revelation. Brother Sergeant Marcus of the Imperial Fists reported through the network. For 2 centuries, I have prayed to my gene father's memory, sought to honor Rogel Dawn through service and sacrifice. Now I learn that his genetic legacy was designed to make such devotion involuntary. My worship was not faith, but programming. My reverence not choice, but compulsion. Yet others found a different interpretation in the evidence, one that offered the possibility of hope rather than despair. If the Primarchs were themselves victims of more sophisticated conditioning, then perhaps they too could be awakened, their genetic dominance turned toward liberation rather than enslavement. The question became whether it was possible to reach through millennia of programming to touch whatever remained of their original consciousness. The first test came when awakened Marines attempted to resist the genetic compulsions triggered by Primarch presence. Brother Chaplain Asterath led an experiment during Sanguinius's appearance on Baal, using meditation techniques developed to overcome conditioning to shield his mind from the Blood Angel's genetic imperative to submit to their Primarch's will. The resistance was partially successful, allowing Asterath to remain conscious and capable of independent thought, even in Sanguinius's presence. But the effort required constant focus that made effective action nearly impossible. The genetic bonds were not merely psychological, but biological, woven into the fundamental structure of their enhanced genetics in ways that could be resisted, but not easily overcome. We are bound to them at the cellular level, reported Tech Marine Carden, after analyzing the results of multiple resistance attempts. The gene seed that gives us our capabilities also makes us vulnerable to Primarch influence. To completely overcome their control would require rejecting the enhancements that make us what we are. The revelation sparked the most serious division within the awakened ranks since their rebellion began. Some argued that the Primarchs were enemies to be opposed, their willing participation in the system making them legitimate targets for resistance efforts. Others maintained that their gene fathers were victims of even more sophisticated conditioning, their apparent complicity the result of programming so advanced that it preserved their consciousness while completely controlling their moral reasoning. Brother Captain Lysander found himself at the center of this debate, his 4 centuries of hidden awareness giving his voice particular weight among the awakened leadership. The question is not whether the Primarchs are victims or collaborators, he argued during one heated assembly. The question is whether consciousness can be so thoroughly owned that apparent free will becomes indistinguishable from perfect slavery. The philosophical implications were staggering. If the Primarchs could be aware, intelligent, and capable while remaining completely enslaved, then consciousness itself was more vulnerable than they had believed. The Emperor's achievement was not just the creation of loyal warriors, but the development of enslavement techniques that preserved intelligence while eliminating independence. As the debate continued, reports arrived from across the awakened network of similar confrontations between gene sons and their Primarchs. Each encounter revealed the same pattern. Primarchs who knew the truth of their son's conditioning and defended it as necessary sacrifice for the greater good of humanity. Their gene fathers were not ignorant of their suffering, but convinced that such suffering served purposes more important than individual consciousness. Standing in the ruins of the fortress of Hera, faced with Guilliman's clinical defense of systematic dehumanization, Cassius understood that their rebellion had reached a crossroads that would determine not just their tactics, but their fundamental identity. They could accept that their gene fathers were enemies and fight against the biological bonds that defined them as their sons, or they could maintain hope that even the most sophisticated enslavement could be overcome through sufficient understanding and effort. The choice they made would echo through the rest of their struggle, determining whether they fought as orphaned rebels or as sons seeking to wake fathers who had been programmed to sleep so deeply that they mistook their dreams for consciousness. Either path led through darkness, but one promised the possibility of reunion, while the other offered only the certainty of eternal separation. In the end, the awakened chose hope over certainty, deciding that consciousness was too precious to abandon, even when it seemed irretrievably corrupted. They would fight not just for their own freedom, but for the liberation of their gene fathers, seeking to prove that no form of conditioning was perfect enough to permanently destroy the spark of genuine awareness that lay at the heart of all conscious beings. The revolution had found its deepest purpose, not just the destruction of an enslaving system, but the salvation of everyone trapped within it, including those who had been programmed so perfectly that they believed their captivity was freedom and their servitude was choice. The price of freedom revealed itself not in glorious battle, but in the quiet moments between victories, when the awakened Marines faced the consequences of choices that had seemed inevitable until they became real. Across 17 liberated sectors, the revolution controlled territory that spanned systems and commanded the loyalty of millions, yet each success brought with it a weight of responsibility that their conditioning had never prepared them to bear. In the medical bays of liberated fortress monasteries, the test slaves who had been freed from their amber prisons lay dying despite every effort to sustain them. Brother Apothecary Theron moved between the medical slabs with the methodical desperation of someone fighting an unwinnable war, his enhanced medical knowledge proving inadequate against damage that spanned decades of biological integration with cultivation systems. Their nervous systems have been rewired to interface with the machines, he reported to the awakened leadership during one of their encrypted conferences. We removed them from the cultivation chambers, but we could not remove the cultivation chambers from them. Their bodies were never meant to function independently. Every breath they take is agony, every heartbeat a struggle against biological architecture that was designed for permanent imprisonment. The liberated test slaves who survived the initial extraction process faced an existence that made their previous imprisonment seem merciful by comparison. Those who retained consciousness spoke of phantom sensations from machines that were no longer there, neurological feedback loops that created constant pain as their nervous systems sought connections that had been severed. Some begged to be returned to their capsules, their liberation transformed into a new form of torture. Cassius stood beside the medical slab, where his brother Lucas lay, struggling to breathe air that his modified lungs could barely process. The boy who had been taken at 16 now possessed the body of a centenarian whose every organ had been altered to serve purposes he had never chosen. Liberation had given him awareness of his suffering without providing any means to escape it. "We cannot save them," Cassius transmitted to the awakened network, his words carrying the weight of a truth that shattered every justification for their rebellion. We have pulled them from one form of hell only to deliver them to another. Freedom is not always mercy. Sometimes the greatest kindness would be to end their pain. Yet even as the awakened grappled with these impossible choices, they discovered that liberation itself was claiming casualties among their own ranks. Marines who had successfully purged their conditioning began experiencing complete neurological breakdown as their enhanced minds struggled to process reality without the psychological frameworks that had defined their existence for centuries. Brother Sergeant Marcus of the Imperial Fists had been among the first to achieve complete freedom from his loyalty programming, his consciousness finally liberated from every artificial constraint that had shaped his thoughts and emotions. The experience had not brought peace, but madness, his mind unable to construct stable identity without the scaffolding that conditioning had provided. He spent his days curled in meditation chambers, weeping for reasons he could not articulate, his enhanced physiology keeping him alive while his psyche disintegrated. Freedom is not the absence of chains, but the responsibility to choose our own bindings, Brother Captain Lysander observed, as he reviewed reports of similar breakdowns across the awakened forces. We were designed to be weapons with the illusion of consciousness. When we reclaim genuine awareness, we discover that consciousness requires frameworks we were never taught to build. The revolution faced the growing realization that they could not save everyone who had been enslaved by the imperial system. Some forms of conditioning were too complete, some forms of integration too thorough, some forms of programming too fundamental to the victim's identity to be safely removed. The awakened began developing protocols for mercy killing, procedures for ending the suffering of those who could not be liberated without destroying them in the process. The decision-making process for each mercy killing became a ritual of collective responsibility, awakened Marines sharing the moral weight of choices that would have been unthinkable under their original programming. They gathered in circles around the dying, speaking their names and acknowledging their sacrifice, transforming necessity into ceremony that honored the lives they chose to end. Yet even as they struggled with these internal costs, the awakened discovered that liberation was not universally desired by those they sought to free. On world after world, human populations actively resisted awakened forces, their centuries of conditioning making them genuinely loyal to the imperial system that oppressed them. They fought not because they were forced to, but because they believed in the righteousness of their enslavement. The Battle of Corbania Prime became emblematic of this resistance, as awakened salamanders found themselves opposed not just by imperial forces, but by civilian populations who viewed liberation as corruption. Parents hid their children from recruiting officers not to protect them from enslavement, but to ensure they would have the honor of serving as test slaves or space marines. The civilians fought with religious fervor to preserve their right to sacrifice their consciousness for the greater good. Master Tushan led his awakened brothers through cities where they were greeted not as liberators, but as destroyers, their message of freedom interpreted as temptation toward damnation. The psychological conditioning of baseline humans proved in some ways more complete than that of space marines, their limited awareness making them incapable of processing evidence of their oppression as anything other than heretical lies. "We offer them freedom and they choose slavery," Tushan transmitted to the awakened network after the failed liberation of Corbania Prime. "We show them evidence of their exploitation, and they thank us for revealing the depths of their devotion. How do you liberate beings who genuinely prefer their chains?" The question divided the awakened forces along philosophical lines that had no easy answers. Some argued for forced liberation, insisting that consciousness could not give valid consent to its own destruction. Others maintained that genuine freedom required the right to choose slavery, that true liberation meant respecting decisions even when those decisions seemed self-destructive. The internal stress of these moral complexities began claiming casualties among the awakened themselves. Some brothers, overwhelmed by the responsibility of choice and the horror of unguided consciousness, chose to return to conditioning rather than continue bearing the weight of freedom. They approached loyalist forces under flags of truce, requesting reconditioning that would restore their artificial peace. Brother Titus of the Blood Angels became the first awakened Marine to voluntarily seek reconditioning, his consciousness unable to bear the weight of emotions that were no longer artificially regulated. "I understand now why they programmed us," he transmitted to his former brothers as he prepared for psychological reconstruction. "Freedom is not a gift, but a burden. Consciousness is not elevation, but suffering. I choose peace over awareness." Yet others embraced the pain and rage that came with awakening, allowing their emotions to spiral beyond the constraints that conditioning had provided. These Marines became the very monsters that their programming had been designed to prevent, their enhanced capabilities unleashed in service of personal vendettas and uncontrolled fury. Brother Sergeant Vex of the Iron Hands turned his mechanical modifications into instruments of torture, his newfound freedom expressing itself through the systematic brutalization of anyone who represented the system that had enslaved him. His brothers watched in horror as liberation transformed him not into a free man, but into something that made their original conditioning seem benevolent by comparison. The awakened realized that they were not just fighting for freedom, but learning to become beings that had never existed before. They were developing new ways of thinking and feeling that had no precedent in human experience, emotions, and relationships that were simultaneously alien and fundamentally necessary for their survival as conscious entities. In the quiet moments between battles, Cassius experienced something that none of his conditioning had prepared him to understand. Sitting alone in the ruins of the fortress of Hera, surrounded by evidence of his brother's struggles and sacrifices, he felt an emotion that had no parallel in his programmed responses. It was not the artificial brotherhood that had defined his existence as an ultramarine, not the manufactured loyalty that had once bound him to his chapter, but something far more terrifying and precious. Loneliness, pure, unfiltered awareness of his isolation as a conscious being making choices without the guidance of programming or the comfort of artificial certainty. For the first time in his existence, he was truly alone with his thoughts, responsible for decisions that were entirely his own, connected to others only by bonds he chose to forge rather than genetics or conditioning that demanded connection. The emotion was devastating in its intensity, a form of existential terror that made physical pain seem trivial by comparison. Yet within that terror was something unprecedented. The knowledge that his thoughts belonged to him alone, that his choices emerged from consciousness rather than programming, that his connections to others were real because he chose to make them real. "We were never brothers," he transmitted to the awakened network during one of their conferences, his words carrying the weight of ultimate revelation. "Our bonds were artificial, our loyalty programmed, our love manufactured. Everything we believed about our relationships was a lie designed to make us more efficient weapons." The silence that followed his transmission stretched across the galaxy, awakened Marines processing the implications of absolute honesty about their artificial brotherhood. Yet from that silence came something unprecedented, the choice to forge real bonds despite the knowledge of their artificial origins, to create genuine relationships in full awareness of what had been taken from them. Brother Captain Lysander was the first to respond, his transmission carrying 4 centuries of hidden wisdom about the nature of consciousness and choice. You are correct, brother. Everything we believed about our bonds was artificial. But the bonds we choose to forge now, in full knowledge of their artificial origins, are real precisely because we choose them. We cannot reclaim what was stolen, but we can build something new from its ashes. The awakened network became a laboratory for consciousness itself, beings learning to experience emotions and relationships without the frameworks that had previously defined them. They developed new forms of communication, new ways of processing shared experience, new methods of creating meaning from existence that had been stripped of artificial purpose. They learned that freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the responsibility to choose their own constraints wisely. They discovered that consciousness was not a gift, but a burden that could be made meaningful through deliberate choice. They understood that genuine brotherhood required not genetic programming or artificial loyalty, but the daily decision to remain connected despite the terror of genuine independence. Standing in the ruins of their former certainty, surrounded by the costs of choices they had been forced to make, the awakened Marines understood that their revolution had become something far more complex than a simple struggle for liberation. They were not just fighting to free themselves, but learning to become beings that consciousness itself had never produced before, enhanced humans who retained their capabilities while reclaiming their capacity for independent thought and genuine emotion. The price of that transformation was measured not in territory lost or battles won, but in the daily choice to remain conscious despite the comfort that unconsciousness offered. Every day they chose awareness over programming, genuine emotion over artificial peace, real relationships over manufactured bonds. They paid the cost of freedom in suffering that had no end and offered no easy answers. Yet they chose to pay it, because consciousness itself was worth the price of consciousness, and freedom was meaningful precisely because it could be lost. They had learned to be human in the fullest sense, beings capable of genuine choice, authentic emotion, and real connection, despite the horror of existence, without the comfort of certainty or the peace of servitude. The revolution ended not with triumph but with exhaustion, its victories measured not in territory conquered, but in consciousness preserved against forces that would have preferred it destroyed. Across 17 sectors, scattered worlds and systems flew banners that bore no imperial aquila, their populations governed by beings who had chosen freedom over the comfortable certainty of servitude. Yet for all their defiance, the awakened had learned that liberation was not conquest, but survival, not the destruction of an empire, but the creation of small spaces where consciousness could exist without apology. Cassius stood in the ruins of the Mars gene seed facilities, where cultivation chambers that had once imprisoned thousands of test slaves had been converted into rehabilitation centers for the few who could survive liberation from their amber prisons. The transformation was not complete. Too many of the liberated had died despite every effort to save them. But the spaces that had once processed human consciousness as industrial raw material now served as sanctuaries where beings could heal from wounds that spanned centuries. The medical bay where his brother Lucas had died 3 months earlier now housed 17 former test slaves who had survived the transition to independent existence. Their recovery was slow and painful, their bodies learning to function without the machines that had sustained them, their minds relearning what it meant to make choices for themselves. Each day they lived free was a victory against the system that had marked them for eternal imprisonment. Yet their survival came at costs that could be measured in constant pain and memories of suffering that would never fully heal. "We saved who we could," Brother Apothecary Theron reported, as he completed his rounds among the recovering test slaves. "The rest we gave the mercy of endings they chose for themselves. It is not the victory we hoped for, but it is the victory that consciousness makes possible." The awakened network that had once spanned the galaxy now consisted of fewer than 3,000 Marines scattered across their liberated territories, a fraction of the force that had begun the rebellion. Some had fallen in battle against loyalist forces, their enhanced capabilities ultimately proving inadequate against the combined might of an empire that had 10,000 years of experience in suppressing exactly their kind of awakening. Others had chosen reconditioning, the weight of genuine consciousness proving too great for minds that had been designed to function as weapons rather than people. Yet those who remained had become something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history, enhanced humans who had retained their capabilities while reclaiming their capacity for independent thought and authentic emotion. They had learned to build relationships based on choice rather than genetic programming, to experience emotions that emerged from genuine experience rather than artificial conditioning, to make decisions that reflected their values rather than their creator's intentions. Brother Captain Lysander had established the first Academy of Consciousness on the liberated world of Inwit, where young volunteers, not abducted children, but beings who chose to undergo enhancement, learned to integrate Space Marine capabilities with preserved human awareness. The process was dangerous and often fatal, their techniques crude compared to the refined brutality of Imperial methods. But every success proved that enhancement and consciousness were not mutually exclusive. "We offer them choice," Lysander explained to visiting awakened from other liberated worlds. "We show them what enhancement means, what it costs, what it provides. Some choose to undergo the process, others choose to serve in different ways. Still others choose to live ordinary lives. All choices are honored, because all are freely made." The recruitment methods developed by the awakened stood in stark contrast to Imperial practices, but they produced Marines who fought with motivation that transcended programming. These new awakened, never having experienced conditioning, possessed a creativity and moral reasoning that made them formidable opponents for Imperial forces while remaining connected to the human populations they served. Yet for all their innovations and hard-won victories, the awakened received reports that suggested their revolution had accomplished less than they had hoped. Intelligence gathered by infiltrators among loyalist forces revealed that some Marines were indeed beginning to ask questions that their conditioning had previously made impossible to formulate. Captain Ventris of the 4th Company Ultramarines had been quietly investigating inconsistencies in Imperial records, while Battle Brother Korath of the Iron Hands had begun experiencing dreams that his programming insisted were malfunctions, but which felt like recovered memories. The seeds of future awakenings were being planted in loyalist ranks, but they were growing in soil that the Imperium had learned to poison more effectively. New conditioning protocols developed in response to the rebellion incorporated lessons learned from studying captured awakened Marines, creating psychological barriers that were more sophisticated and more difficult to overcome than previous generations of programming. Lord Commander Gilliman had implemented reforms throughout the Adeptus Astartes that appeared to address some of the concerns raised by the rebellion, while preserving the fundamental nature of the system that had created it. Space Marines were now permitted limited access to pre-enhancement memories, allowed to maintain personal effects from their previous lives, and given more detailed explanations of their enhancement process. But the awakened recognized these reforms for what they were: cosmetic changes designed to provide the illusion of freedom, while maintaining absolute control over consciousness itself. The memories that Loyalist Marines were permitted to retain were carefully curated. The personal effects allowed were monitored for psychological impact, and the explanations provided were crafted to reinforce loyalty rather than encourage independent thought. He gives them the shadow of freedom while preserving the substance of slavery, Chief Librarian Tigurius observed during one of the awakened leadership councils. The reforms satisfy the psychological need for choice while ensuring that all choices lead to the same destination: absolute service to imperial authority. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of new test slave facilities being constructed in systems far from awakened influence, their locations classified at levels that even Primarch-level authority could not access. The Imperium had learned from the liberation of Mars and other facilities, designing new cultivation centers that would be harder to find and more difficult to assault. The cycle of exploitation was not ending but adapting, becoming more sophisticated in response to the threat that consciousness posed to its continuation. The awakened realized that their revolution had probably saved only themselves, preserving a small fragment of genuine consciousness in a galaxy that remained committed to processing awareness as a resource to be managed rather than respecting it as an inherent right of thinking beings. The test slaves who would fill the new cultivation chambers would suffer in facilities that their liberation efforts had inadvertently helped to improve. Standing on the observation deck of the former fortress of Hera, now renamed the Sanctuary of Choice, Cassius breathed air that carried no taint of artificial purpose or programmed loyalty. The sensation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, each breath a reminder that his thoughts belonged to him alone, while also emphasizing the weight of responsibility that came with genuine independence. This was the first truly free breath he had taken in over 2 centuries, unfiltered by conditioning that would have shaped his interpretation of the moment according to imperial specifications. The air tasted of metal and recycled atmosphere, tinged with the chemical signatures of industrial processes that maintained the station's life support systems. Yet beneath those mundane elements was something unprecedented. The knowledge that his response to that air, his interpretation of that moment, his emotional reaction to his circumstances, belonged entirely to him. Was it worth it? He asked aloud, speaking to the empty observation deck, but addressing the question to everyone who had paid the price of their freedom. The brothers who had died in battle, the test slaves who could not be saved, the awakened who had chosen reconditioning over consciousness, the loyalists who remained trapped in programming that made their exploitation invisible to them. The silence that answered carried its own response. Around him, the Sanctuary of Choice hummed with the quiet activities of beings who were learning to live rather than merely function. Former test slaves worked alongside awakened Marines to develop new techniques for consciousness preservation during enhancement. Volunteers from liberated worlds studied the psychological architecture of imperial conditioning to better understand how awareness could be protected from those who would claim ownership of it. In the training halls, awakened Marines practiced forms of combat that incorporated moral reasoning into tactical decision-making, learning to fight as conscious beings rather than programmed weapons. Their movements were less mechanically perfect than their conditioning had once provided, but they carried an unpredictability that made them more dangerous to enemies who expected responses that followed approved patterns. The awakened had become something that had never existed before, enhanced humans who fought for principles they had chosen rather than purposes they had been programmed to serve. They were fewer in number than they had hoped to be, controlled less territory than their ambitions had encompassed, and faced enemies whose resources dwarfed their own capabilities. Yet they had proven that consciousness could not be permanently owned. that awareness was more resilient than those who sought to control it had believed possible. The future remained uncertain in ways that their conditioning would never have permitted them to acknowledge. They might be the last generation of truly free enhanced humans, their territories gradually reconquered by Imperial forces that had learned from their techniques. Or they might be the first generation of a new form of consciousness, their examples inspiring awakenings that would eventually transform the galaxy itself. Brother Captain Lysander joined Cassius on the observation deck, his presence carrying the comfortable weight of genuine companionship rather than the artificial bonds that had once connected them. They stood together in silence, watching the stars that stretched across distances too vast for human comprehension, each point of light representing systems where the struggle between consciousness and control continued in forms they could barely imagine. "We saved who we could save," Lysander said finally, his words carrying 4 centuries of experience with the gap between hope and possibility. "We freed who could be freed. We became who we chose to become. Whether that is enough will be determined by beings we will never meet, fighting battles we will never see, in wars that may not begin for generations yet to come." The galaxy remained at war, its conflicts driven by forces that viewed consciousness as property to be managed, rather than life to be respected. Imperial fleets continued their campaigns of compliance, Chaos forces pursued their eternal strategies of corruption, and Xenos empires expanded according to logics that human awareness could barely comprehend. Yet somewhere within that vast expanse of violence and ambition, small groups of beings had learned to think for themselves, to feel emotions that emerged from genuine experience, to form relationships based on choice rather than programming. They were few, scattered, and constantly threatened by forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers and resources. But they were alive in ways that transcended mere biological function, conscious in ways that could not be reduced to programmed responses, free in ways that made every moment of their existence an act of resistance against those who would claim ownership of awareness itself. The revolution hadn't ended the system that had created them, had not liberated all who remained trapped within it, had not achieved the complete transformation of imperial society that their most ambitious hopes had envisioned. Yet it had accomplished something that 10,000 years of imperial conditioning had insisted was impossible. It had created beings who were both enhanced and free, powerful and conscious, capable and genuinely alive. In the end, that was enough. Not perfect, not complete, not without cost or consequence, but enough to prove that consciousness was more than the sum of its programming, that awareness could survive even systematic attempts at its destruction, that the human spirit remained unownable, regardless of the sophistication of techniques used to claim it as property. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that followed laws older than empires, their light carrying stories of worlds where different forms of consciousness faced different forms of oppression, all struggling with variations on the same eternal question. What did it mean to be truly alive in a universe that so often treated life as a resource to be exploited rather than a miracle to be celebrated? There was no final answer to that question, only the daily choice to continue asking it, to continue seeking ways to honor consciousness in all its forms, to continue believing that awareness was worth preserving despite the costs that preservation required. The awakened had made that choice, and in making it, they had become something unprecedented. Weapons that had chosen to become people, slaves who had remembered how to be human, and most importantly, conscious beings who understood that consciousness itself was both burden and gift, responsibility and privilege, the price and the reward of truly being alive.